Um, Welcome to the deep dive.
You have probably been told at some point in your life to make a vision board.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone has.
Right. To just sit down, close your eyes, and intensely visualize your ultimate success, the dream job, the perfect relationship, the fitness goals.
The whole law of attraction thing.
Exactly. We are constantly fed this idea by the self-help world that if we can just see it, we can achieve it. But what if I told you that doing exactly that, what if sitting around visualizing your success is actually destroying your motivation to achieve it?
It really is one of the most profound paradoxes in modern psychology.
Yeah.
And it goes against almost everything the billion-dollar motivational industry tells us. We are going to explore the biological reality of why our brains actually punish us for daydreaming about the finish line before we've even laced up our running shoes.
Yeah, and our mission for you today, for you listening, is to help you understand the biological traps of daydreaming, to figure out how to bridge what researchers call the intention-behavior gap.
Which is a huge hurdle. Massive. And to fundamentally shift your focus away from outcome obsession and toward process-oriented consistency. To do this, we are unpacking a really massive stack of research today. We're pulling heavily from James Clear's best-selling book, Atomic Habits. We also have a series of psychological studies from PLOS One, which is a big peer-reviewed open-access journal, and research synthesized by Sciblog, which is an excellent hub for empirical psychology findings.
We're also bringing in insights from modern Stoicism, some cutting-edge research on situated cognition by Dr. Esther Papes, and some incredibly hard-hitting critiques from the New Man podcast, hosted by Trip Lanier, as well as the Mindset Reboot channel.
Yeah, and we will even touch on some pretty wild futuristic concepts from the journal Technological Forecasting and Social Change, and dive into the behavioral economics of something called hyperbolic discounting.
It is a packed stack.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. I want to start with the biology, because looking through our notes on the dopamine system completely blew my mind. We constantly hear about dopamine as the pleasure chemical. Like you eat a piece of chocolate, you get a hit of dopamine, you feel good.
The reward molecule.
Yeah, but looking at the research, that seems to be a massive oversimplification. The brain is releasing dopamine, not just when we experience pleasure, but when we simply anticipate it.
And that distinction changes everything about how we understand human motivation. For decades, the general public and even many scientists just assumed dopamine was purely about the experience of pleasure. But the research highlighted in Atomic Habits completely flips this understanding. There was a highly influential experiment conducted by neuroscientists James Olds and Peter Milner.
Okay.
They wanted to understand the actual mechanics of craving, so they implanted electrodes into the brains of rats to physically block the release of dopamine.
Wait, they just completely shut off the dopamine tap.
Completely turned it off.
What actually happens to a mammal when you do that?
The results were staggering. The rats lost all will to live. They wouldn't eat, they wouldn't mate, they wouldn't even walk across their cage. They simply huddled in a corner and eventually died of thirst.
Wow. See, my first thought reading that was, okay, they can't feel pleasure anymore, so life is just gray and miserable. Is that what was happening?
See, that is the fascinating part. In follow-up studies, researchers took these completely dopamine-depleted rats and squirted sugar water directly into their mouths.
Okay, so forcing a reward.
Right. And the rats still showed the typical physical and facial expressions of pleasure. They still liked the sugar, they enjoyed the taste, but without dopamine, they had lost the desire to go get it.
Oh, wow.
Without desire, action stopped entirely. Dopamine is not the reward itself, it is the engine of craving that drives us toward the reward.
So it's not the satisfaction of crossing the finish line. It's the chemical that gets you out of bed at 5 in the morning to train for the race. But this is where it gets incredibly dangerous for us as humans, right? Because our brains are these highly advanced simulation machines. According to the research from Sciblog, featuring the work of psychologists Gabriel Odingen and Thomas Mayer, positive fantasies actually trick the brain. Can you explain how our own imaginations are working against us here?
We have to look at something called a reward prediction error. This is a fundamental concept in neuroscience. Dopamine is essentially a calculation system. Your brain makes a prediction. It says, if I do X, I will get a reward of Y.
Okay.
If you do the work and the reward is better than expected, you get a massive dopamine spike. If it's exactly as expected, it remains stable. But if you fall short, dopamine crashes and you feel intensely demotivated.
Okay, so how does daydreaming mess up that calculation?
When you close your eyes and vividly imagine achieving your goal,
Like getting the promotion or losing weight?
right, buying the dream house, You experience a premature dopamine spike in the present moment. Your brain is running a highly realistic simulation. And because it can't always distinguish between a vividly imagined future and current reality, it essentially goes, wow, we did it. We achieved the goal. Good job, everybody.
You are giving yourself the neurochemical reward of success without having done a single ounce of the actual work.
Exactly.
Which means when you open your eyes and realize you still have to do the grueling work, your dopamine crashes because of that reward prediction error. The reality is so much harder and less immediately rewarding than the fantasy.
And the data backs that up emphatically. The Sideblog research looked at people facing major life challenges. So university students trying to get a job, people looking for a romantic partner, students trying to pass a difficult exam, and even patients recovering from hip replacement surgery.
Broad spectrum.
Very broad. They found that the individuals who spent the most time entertaining positive fantasies about a seamless, successful outcome actually performed the worst across the board.
That is wild.
It gets worse. 2 years after college, the people who were identified as heavy dreamers had applied for fewer jobs, received fewer offers, and were earning significantly lower salaries than the people who didn't spend their time fantasizing about a perfect career.
Because the fantasy provides that premature satisfaction.
Right.
It literally drains the physiological motivation we need to overcome the inevitable friction and obstacles of real life.
Right.
The Mindset Reboot channel has a brilliant, slightly harsh term for this. They call it being a mental millionaire.
I love that term.
It's so good. We become addicted to the idea of success, but we are deeply allergic to the actual work that greatness requires. We are chasing a hit of dopamine from a fantasy, and then we wonder why we have no energy to send the email or go to the gym.
That source shares a perfect anecdote that illustrates this beautifully. They talk about a young student who wanted to start a business. He spent 3 entire months just branding his new company. Oh, yes. He designed the perfect sleek logo, ordered expensive, heavy cardstock business cards, and crafted the ultimate, highly curated Instagram bio. He felt incredibly productive. But when he was asked how many actual sales calls he had made in those 3 months, the answer was 0.
0. He wasn't building a business. He was playing house. He fell in love with the identity of being an entrepreneur, and he got all the dopamine from the aesthetic of the business, but he actively avoided the terrifying friction of trying to sell something and getting rejected.
Which brings up a crucial distinction from the Ampersunder blog, which breaks down a core concept from Atomic Habits. It is the fundamental difference between motion and action. They sound incredibly similar to the untrained ear, but they are practically opposites when it comes to producing real-world results.
I have to confess, I am the king of motion. When you are in motion, you are planning, you are strategizing, you are learning, you're outlining 20 ideas for articles you want to write. A few years ago, I decided I wanted to get into trail running. I spent a full month researching the absolute best trail running shoes. I bought a specialized hydration pack. I read 3 books on ultramarathon runners. I curated the ultimate high-tempo Spotify playlist. I felt like an absolute athlete.
Let me guess.
I didn't run a single mile, not one.
That is the ultimate trap of motion. Motion never produces an outcome by itself. You can talk to a personal trainer 10 times. That is motion. You can watch 100 YouTube videos on proper squat form. That is motion. Only the action of getting under the bar and lifting the weights will actually change your physical body.
So why do we do it? Why do we get so deeply stuck in the planning phase? The Ampersunder piece nails the psychology of it. Motion allows us to feel like we're making progress without ever running the risk of failure. It is safe. Action is inherently scary.
It's vulnerable.
Yes. When you sit down to actually write the article or launch the business or go on the run, you invite judgment. You risk someone saying, this is terrible, or you risk realizing you aren't as good as your fantasy suggested. Motion is a highly effective, socially acceptable disguise for procrastination.
Trip Lanier talks about this extensively on the New Man podcast. He openly admits to being a recovering self-development jackass, which is just a great phrase.
I love that.
He shares this deeply relatable story where he spent 2 entire years reading books about meditation, listening to gurus, and buying cushions before he ever actually sat down in silence and tried meditating for 5 minutes.
2 years of reading about being present while completely avoiding the present.
Exactly the irony. He makes the compelling point that in our modern culture, devouring self-help books and listening to educational podcasts, even this very deep dive you are listening to right now, can become just another dopamine fix.
Ouch.
I know it hurts. It makes us feel smart. It makes us feel capable. It gives us the illusion of forward momentum. But gathering information is categorically not the same thing as doing the difficult work in the trenches.
I think we need to speculate on the broader societal impact of this for a moment, because we don't just live in a world with a few distractions. We live in an era of what evolutionary biologists call supernormal stimuli.
Right.
Our environments, especially our digital ones, are highly engineered by some of the smartest engineers on the planet to deliver excessive, unearned dopamine hits. Social media delivers more social praise and validation in 5 minutes than our ancestors might have received in an entire year on the savannah. Are we replacing the dirty, difficult, unglamorous process of real progress with the highly curated aesthetic of progress?
It is a profound existential concern. If your brain is constantly flooded with the dopamine of simulated success, whether through vivid daydreaming, watching motivational day-in-the-life vlogs of successful people, or endlessly planning your own unexecuted projects, you are artificially exhausting your motivation reserves.
Wow.
You are draining of the very neurochemical you need to propel you through the boredom and friction of real-world action. We are creating a culture of spectators who are exhausted from watching other people play the game.
Okay, let's unpack this further because this brings us to the next massive roadblock. Let's say we realize we are stuck in motion. We put down the books, we stop daydreaming, and we set a real, tangible intention to take action. I am going to the gym tomorrow at 6 a.m. We are highly motivated. And then we still fail spectacularly. The alarm goes off and we hit snooze. Why do our well-meaning, deeply sincere intentions dissolve the second they hit the real world?
To understand why we abandon our plans so quickly, we have to look at something called the intention-behavior gap. There is fascinating research by Dr. Esther Papes on a psychological framework called situated cognition. She looked at massive meta-analyses of behavior change programs, and the statistics are actually quite startling.
Just lay it on me.
They found that while psychological interventions can successfully change a person's conscious intentions, those new intentions only account for about 30% of their actual behavior change.
Wait, 30%. I mean, 70% of what we actually do every single day has absolutely nothing to do with what we consciously intend to do. That feels almost deterministic.
It is deeply humbling to realize how little conscious control we exert in the moment. The reason for this gap comes down to a heavy academic concept Papes calls situated conceptualizations.
Hold on, that's a dense academic phrase. Let's slow down. What does a situated conceptualization actually mean for me when I walk into my kitchen or go about my day?
Think of your brain not as a logical filing cabinet, but as a giant, highly reactive pattern recognition machine. Our behaviors, our habits, our impulsive reactions, our hedonic cravings, they are not stored in our brains as abstract concepts or logical rules. They are intimately tied to specific situational cues in our environment.
The environment is the trigger.
Exactly. When you encounter a familiar situation, your brain instantly retrieves the entire sensory and behavioral package associated with it.
Wow, okay. So, looking at Papes' research, she uses the example of a coffee shop. Let's say my conscious intention is I want to eat healthy and I need to save money. No junk food, no expensive lattes. I am logically committed to this. But then I walk down the street and pass a bakery or a coffee shop.
Walk me through what happens to your brain in that exact moment.
Well, I smell the freshly baked muffins. I hear the hissing of the espresso machine. I hear the low hum of the background indie music. According to Papes, that specific environment triggers a deeply stored situated conceptualization. My brain instantly simulates the entire experience. It remembers the feeling of peeling the paper wrapper off the muffin, the rush of the sugar hitting my tongue, the warmth of the coffee cup in my hands. And that intense sensory simulation completely overwrites my logical, conscious intention to save money.
It bypasses the conscious prefrontal cortex of your brain entirely. The urge hits you before logic even has a chance to formulate an argument. And this is vital to understand. Failing in that moment is not a moral failing. It is not a lack of character or a sign that you are a weak person. It is a software glitch in how the human animal evolved.
Which brings us to a fascinating behavioral economics paper we have in our stack. It was published on SSRN, which, for those who don't know, is the Social Science Research Network, a massive open-access repository for early-stage scholarly research across dozens of disciplines. The paper has a provocative title. Hyperbolic discounting is not lack of self-control.
Hyperbolic discounting is the economic term for our tendency to choose a smaller, immediate reward over a much larger, delayed reward. If I offer you $50 today or $100 in a year, most people take the $50 today. The paper argues that human beings are evolutionarily hardwired to prioritize the present because of the environment in which our brains developed.
Right, because our brains didn't evolve in modern office buildings with 401k matching. We evolved on the African savanna or in similar hunter-gatherer environments.
Think about the reality of an immediate return environment. For hundreds of thousands of years of human history, if you found calories, a bush of sweet berries, or a fresh kill, you ate them immediately. If you saw a predator, you ran immediately. Decisions had instant life or death consequences. The distant future was entirely uncertain. You might not survive the winter, let alone the next decade. It was an exceptionally brilliant survival strategy to prioritize the present moment and heavily discount the future.
But today, we live in a completely mismatched, delayed return environment. We go to work today for a paycheck we won't see for 2 weeks. We go to the gym today for a cardiovascular benefit we won't realize for a decade. We save money for a retirement that is 40 years away. Our modern society was built in the last few hundred years, but our brains are still operating on software optimized for Pleistocene survival.
There is a brilliant quote highlighted in Atomic Habits from a 19th century French eponymist named Frédéric Bastiat. He perfectly summarized this evolutionary trap long before we had the neuroscience to prove it. He said, often, the sweeter the first fruit of a habit, the more bitter are its later fruits.
That is profound. The cost of your good habits is entirely in the present. The cost of your bad habits is entirely in the future. Eating the glazed donut is sweet and incredibly rewarding right now, but the health cost is years away. Going for a run in the freezing rain is miserable and painful right now, but the health benefit is years away. We are constantly fighting our own evolutionary programming.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an interesting, somewhat speculative question. Will we always be trapped by this biological flaw? There is a fascinating paper from the journal Technological Forecasting and Social Change that explores the extreme future of human evolution. They discuss cybernetic enhancement and the concept of mind uploading.
Mind upload.
Yeah. They hypothesize a future where our deeply flawed, impulse-driven biological neurons are gradually replaced by perfectly rational synthetic hardware.
It sounds like pure science fiction, but it highlights the reality of our current biological limitations by contrast. A perfectly synthetic computational brain wouldn't fall prey to hyperbolic discounting. It wouldn't get hijacked by the smell of a muffin. It would perfectly mathematically weigh the long-term benefit of a healthy diet against the short-term pleasure of sugar, and it would choose the healthy option every single time without friction. But because we are running on this ancient, wet biological hardware, we are highly susceptible to situational cues. Our grand intentions are simply outmatched by our sensory environments.
Which means we are constantly failing someone very important, our future selves. When you make a plan to lose weight or write a book or save for retirement, you are actually making a plan for future you. You are assigning tasks to a person who doesn't exist yet. But when the moment of decision actually arrives, when the alarm goes off at 6 a.m., instant gratification usually wins because present you is the one making the call, and present you wants to stay in the warm bed.
So, what does this all mean for how we visualize the future? If daydreaming about the finish line kills our motivation and our biological hardware constantly prioritizes the present comfort, how do we ever connect with that future self in a way that actually works? How do we bridge that gap? This brings us to a genuinely mind-bending study published in PLOS One regarding virtual reality and psychological embodiment.
This is one of the most innovative pieces of research in our entire stack. It was conducted by Gansho and a team of researchers. They wanted to see if they could bridge the intention-behavior gap by using immersive VR to manipulate how people perceive their future selves. They took 90 male university students and put them through a highly controlled virtual reality experience.
I saw this study in our notes, but I couldn't entirely wrap my head around the methodology. What exactly did they have these students do?
In the virtual environment, the student would sit in a room across from an empty chair. Then they would look into a virtual mirror. But they didn't see their current reflection. They saw a highly realistic avatar of themselves that had been aged by a sophisticated algorithm to look exactly 10 years older. Receding hairlines, wrinkles, changes in skin tone.
Just seeing your own face, but a decade older, staring back at you in high-definition VR, that alone is wild.
It gets much deeper. After getting used to their older appearance, the researchers had them switch chairs in the VR space. The students would mentally embody the older avatar. They would then listen to questions that had been pre-recorded by their present selves, and they had to answer those questions, speaking as their older, successful future selves.
So they're essentially interviewing their future self while playing the role of their future self. What were the researchers actually trying to test with this elaborate setup?
They were manipulating two key psychological domains. First, they wanted to measure how connected the participants felt to their future self. Did they care about this older person? Second, they measured how similar they felt to their future self. Did they view this older person as basically the same guy, just with gray hair, or someone fundamentally different?
And the findings were completely counterintuitive. We usually hear in motivational seminars that to achieve a goal, you need to feel like you are already that successful person. Fake it till you make it. You have to merge your identity with the future state. But the study found that while feeling connected to your future self increases positive behavior, feeling similar to your future self actually decreases it.
This is where we have to unpack the difference between self-continuity and the self-gap. If you feel too similar to your future self, you experience what psychologists call self-continuity to a fault. You don't perceive a gap between where you are and where you want to be. If present you and future, you are essentially the same entity in your mind. Why do you need to change your behavior?
Right.
Why do the hard work of saving money or exercising if everything is going to be basically the same?
You get complacent.
Exactly. However, if you feel connected to that future person, like you have a moral responsibility to take care of them, almost like an older sibling, but you recognize that you are currently dissimilar to them, it creates a powerful psychological tension. Recognizing the self-gap, the massive daunting distance between who you are now and who you want to be in 10 years, is what actually motivates sustained action. You realize, I am not that person yet, and I have a lot of work to do to become them.
This perfectly aligns with the Cyblog research from Oettingen and Mayer regarding the crucial difference between expectations and fantasies. We talked earlier about how fantasies trick your brain with premature dopamine, but expectations are a completely different psychological mechanism. An expectation is deeply rooted in reality. It is an anticipation of an outcome based on past experiences of success and a realistic, sober assessment of the massive obstacles in your way.
Let's draw a clear line between the two. When you fantasize, you deliberately ignore the obstacles. You imagine a frictionless path to glory. When you have a positive expectation, you acknowledge the difficulty, you anticipate the friction, but you believe in your underlying capacity to handle it. The researchers found that positive expectations lead to actual success, finding a job, recovering faster from surgery, while positive fantasies lead directly to failure and lethargy.
Think about how many modern goal-setting exercises might inadvertently be sabotaging us. If we are sitting around creating vision boards, visualizing a pure, frictionless, perfect future state, we are closing that self-gap artificially. We are making ourselves feel too similar to the end result without doing the work. We lose all the tension. Extrapolating from that VR study, imagine if we used everyday technology to constantly remind ourselves of the dissimilar but connected future self. What if your phone's lock screen was an artificially aged photo of yourself looking disappointed every time you picked it up to scroll social media instead of working?
It sounds a bit extreme, perhaps even dystopian, but it highlights the profound need to keep the reality of the future salient in our daily decision-making. We have to stop fixating on the fantasy of the outcome and start focusing on fundamentally changing our current identity.
Which brings us to the core thesis of Atomic Habits. And arguably the most important concept in James Clear's work, True Behavior Change, is identity change. Clear outlines three distinct layers of behavior change, like the layers of an onion. The outermost layer is the outcome changing your results. This is losing weight, publishing a book, winning a championship. The middle layer is the process changing your habits and systems. This is implementing a new gym routine or writing 1,000 words a day. But the deepest core layer is identity changing your underlying beliefs, your worldview, and your self-image.
And the problem is, most people start from the outside in. They start at the outcome. They look in the mirror and say, I want to be skinny. Then they look at the process. If I stick to this miserable diet for 6 months, I will achieve the outcome of being skinny. They completely ignore the underlying identity. But your behaviors are usually just a reflection of the type of person you subconsciously believe you are. If your underlying identity is someone who prioritizes immediate comfort over long-term accomplishment, no diet in the world will last. The behavior is incongruent with your self-image, and eventually identity always wins.
I love the etymology that Clear brings up in the book for the word identity. It's one of those words we use constantly without thinking about its roots. It comes from the Latin words essentitas, which means being, and identidem, which means repeatedly. Your identity is literally your repeated beingness.
Let's pause on that because it is so empowering. You are not born with preset, unchangeable beliefs about yourself. You aren't genetically hardwired to be a procrastinator or bad at math. Every belief you have about yourself is learned and conditioned through experience. When you make your bed every single day, you are casting a vote that you are an organized person. Every action is a suggestion to your subconscious, hey, maybe this is who I am.
This raises an important question about how we define success in our lives. Are we defining it by momentary goals or by continuous systems? Because Clear makes a really strong argument that goals are actually incredibly problematic for long-term happiness.
He points out that achieving a goal only changes your life for a single fleeting moment. Let's say you have a chronically messy room. You get a burst of motivation, you spend 3 hours cleaning, and you achieve your goal of a clean room. But if you haven't changed the sloppy identity and the underlying systems that led to the mess in the first place, if you still throw your clothes on the floor when you're tired, you will just have a new pile of clutter in a week. You are treating a symptom without curing the underlying disease.
Not to mention, goals actively restrict your happiness. The implicit assumption of a goal-driven life is, I will finally be happy when I'll be happy when I get the promotion, I'll be happy when I lose 20 pounds. You are constantly pushing satisfaction into the future, and it creates a brutal yo-yo effect. Think about how many people train intensely for a marathon, cross the finish line, get their medal, and then don't run a single step for 6 months. The goal is gone, so the motivation vanishes completely. A system, however, provides continuous satisfaction. You win every single time your system is running.
This is where the wisdom of modern Stoicism becomes so highly relevant to habit formation. We have an article here by Rob Thompson writing about setting Stoic goals. If success to you is achieving a specific external outcome, like getting a bestseller or making $1 million, despite what life throws at you, you are setting yourself up for deep misery. The Stoic understands that external events are largely out of our control. The market crashes, you get sick, the publisher rejects the book. Therefore, the true Stoic defines success not as the outcome, but as the effort. Success is doing your absolute best to deal with the uncertainty of life using the tools you have today.
Thompson writes, define success before you start on any activity. Success can be meeting the target set or effort or both. If you let go of the fantasy outcome, you can actually just enjoy the daily work. When you fixate on the future outcome, you literally cannot be happy with where you are in the present moment.
But embracing the process over the outcome requires surviving what Clear calls the valley of disappointment. This is a crucial concept for anyone trying to change their life. When you start a new system, you expect progress to be linear. You run every day for a month, you look in the mirror, and you wonder why your body hasn't drastically changed. You feel cheated. But compounding habits don't work linearly. The most powerful outcomes are always delayed. You have to cross what he calls the plateau of latent potential.
The ice cube metaphor for this is legendary, and it's something I think about constantly when I'm frustrated. Imagine an ice cube sitting on a table in a room that is 25 degrees Fahrenheit. You start heating the room, 26, 27, 28. You are putting in work, you are adding heat to the system, but the ice cube does not change at all. 29, 30, 31. Still nothing. You feel like complaining. You feel like your work is completely wasted. But then you hit 22 degrees and the ice begins to melt.
The profound lesson there is that the work wasn't wasted. It was simply being stored. All the visible action happens at 32 degrees, but it required all the invisible work beforehand to get there. It is exactly the same with the Chinese bamboo plant, which spends 5 entire years building massive, invisible root systems underground without showing a single green shoot above the soil. Then, suddenly, it shoots 90 feet into the air in just 6 weeks. The outside world calls it an overnight success, but the grower knows it was the invisible systems built during the Valley of Disappointment.
And getting through that valley requires a deep identity change. Claire gives a great example of two people trying to quit smoking. Someone offers them a cigarette. The first person says, "No thanks, I'm trying to quit." That is outcome-based. They still view themselves as a smoker who is currently denying themselves a pleasure. The second person says, "No thanks, I'm not a smoker." That tiny, subtle shift in language signals a massive shift in identity. The behavior is no longer a struggle of willpower, it is simply a reflection of who they are.
But identity conflict is a massive barrier for us. Think about modern society. Society constantly pushes us to adopt the identity of a consumer. We are bombarded by advertising, by algorithms designed by behavioral psychologists to make us endlessly consume content, fast food, cheap products. But deep down, many of us want an identity as creators. We want to write books, to build businesses, to paint. If your underlying socially conditioned identity is a consumer, it will constantly sabotage your fragile new habits as a creator.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How do we actually fix this? We've talked about how dopamine works against us, how our intentions fail against situational cues, and how we need to change our identity. But how do we actually rewire these habits and identities in a practical day-to-day way, especially when we know our willpower is so weak.
We have to engineer the process. We have to mathematically bridge the intention-behavior gap using highly specific strategies. Going back to Dr. Pappy's research on situated cognition, she distinguishes between cueing interventions and training interventions. A cueing intervention changes the external environment. It's the nudges, the upstream policy, removing the junk food from your pantry. But a training intervention changes your internal underlying response to the environment. And the most effective training intervention is what psychologists call an implementation intention.
Right. I love this concept. This is moving from a vague, easily abandoned intention like I will exercise more this week to a highly specific mathematical formula. When situation X arises, I will perform response Y. You are explicitly tying the new habit to a specific time and location cue. At 7 a.m. when I pour my first cup of coffee in the kitchen, I will drop and do 10 push-ups. You are taking the exhausting decision-making process out of the moment.
You are preloading the decision. And James Clear expands on this beautifully with the 4 laws of behavior change. If you want to build a good habit, you must make it obvious, attractive, easy, and satisfying. If you want to break a bad habit, you simply invert those laws. You must make it invisible, unattractive, difficult, and unsatisfying.
Let's talk about making it attractive because this involves a brilliant psychological hack called temptation bundling. It is based on something called Premack's principle, which states that a highly probable, deeply desired behavior will reinforce a less probable, less desired behavior.
Oh.
Basically, you strategically pair something you genuinely want to do with something you need to do.
The example of the engineering student from Ireland, Ronan Byrne, is perfect here. He knew he needed to exercise more, but what he really wanted to do was watch Netflix. He loved binge-watching shows. So he used his engineering skills to hack his stationary bike and wrote a computer program that connected the bike to his laptop. Netflix would only play if he was cycling at a certain speed. If he slowed down or stopped, the show paused. He literally bundled his temptation with his required action.
That is genius. And you can use this for anything, even without engineering skills. You only let yourself listen to your absolute favorite true crime podcast while you are doing the dishes or folding laundry. You only read celebrity gossip or scroll TikTok while you are walking on the treadmill. What about making a bad habit unsatisfying? How do we deal with habits of avoidance, like trying to save money by not buying the $6 coffee? Because when you don't buy a coffee, nothing happens. It just feels like deprivation.
That is a critical problem because of hyperbolic discounting. Deprivation has no immediate reward, so you have to artificially make the avoidance visible and rewarding. Clear suggests creating a loyalty program for yourself. Open a separate savings account and name it leather jacket or trip to Italy or whatever you are deeply desiring to buy. Every single time you successfully avoid the temptation of a latte or fast food lunch, immediately pull out your phone and transfer that exact amount, $5 or $10, into that specific account.
You are turning the invisible, miserable pain of deprivation into a highly visible, immediate satisfaction of progress toward a goal. You are fighting the brain's hyperbolic discounting by creating an artificial, immediate reward.
Precisely. And to make new habits easier to start, you use a technique called habit stacking. You identify a habit you already do effortlessly, automatically every single day, like brushing your teeth, flushing the toilet, or making the bed, and you stack the new fragile habit directly on top of it. After I brush my teeth, I will immediately meditate for 2 minutes. You are using the deep, established momentum of an existing neural pathway to pull the new habit along.
But let's be honest. Eventually, even the best engineered habits, even the cleverest temptation bundles run into a massive wall. The initial novelty wears off, the podcast gets boring, the savings account grows too slowly. And this brings us to perhaps the most profound realization in this entire deep dive, the absolute necessity of embracing boredom.
Yes. The Mindset Reboot channel talks extensively about the boredom benchmark. True mastery in any field isn't found in the peak moments of hype, motivation, and inspiration. It is found when the daily work becomes so remarkably normal, so fiercely mundane, that you no longer feel any need to post about it on social media.
James Clear shares a story about asking an Olympic weightlifting coach what the actual difference was between the absolute best athletes in the world and everyone else who tries and fails. The coach didn't say genetics, he didn't say passion, he didn't say luck. He said, at some point it comes down to who can handle the boredom of training every day, doing the exact same lifts over and over and over.
We have this deeply toxic idea in our culture that highly successful people have some bottomless magical reserve of passion and motivation. We think they wake up every day thrilled to do the work. They don't. They feel the exact same lack of motivation, the exact same fatigue, the exact same desire to hit snooze as everyone else. The only difference is that they have built an identity that forces them to show up despite the boredom. Clear notes that the greatest threat to success is not failure, but boredom. We get bored because the outcome becomes expected and routine.
It is a fundamental human flaw. The philosopher Machiavelli noted centuries ago that men desire novelty to such an extent that those who are doing well wish for a change as much as those who are doing badly. We are so deeply addicted to the variable rewards of modern life, the constant ping of notifications, the endless scroll of new information, the drama of the news cycle, that a predictable, compounding system feels agonizingly dull to us. Boredom has actually become the ultimate competitive advantage in the 21st century. If you can simply endure the monotony of doing the work while everyone else is seeking a new hit of dopamine, you will eventually win.
The Stoics practice something called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. It means actively anticipating the difficulty and the friction before you begin. As the host of Mindset Reboot says, success is not a series of peak moments. It is a long, repetitive sequence of boring tasks done with excellence. You have to fall in love with the unglamorous process of carving the stone, not just the finished, polished statue. The friction is where the fans are separated from the players.
And we can optimize this slightly with what Clear calls the Goldilocks rule. Humans experience peak motivation when working on tasks that are right on the edge of their current abilities. Not too hard, not too easy, just challenging enough to require full focus. But even then, eventually the habit will become routine and it will become boring. That is the moment of truth. Stepping up to the plate when it is annoying or painful or draining, that is what separates the professional from the amateur.
Okay, let's pull all of this together. We have gone on a massive journey today. We started by exploring the deeply counterintuitive biology of how our own brains sabotage us with unearned dopamine when we merely daydream about success, or when we spend all our time in the safety of motion, endlessly planning instead of doing the terrifying work of action.
We learned that our good intentions are mathematically proven to be incredibly weak against the simulational cues of our environment. That's a software glitch caused by our evolutionary wiring on the African savanna, where hyperbolic discounting kept us alive but now keeps us broken out of shape. We saw the fascinating VR study showing that closing the gap to our future self isn't about feeling perfectly similar to them, but feeling deeply connected while recognizing the massive motivating distance we still have to travel.
We discovered that true, lasting behavior change is never really about the outcome. It is about fundamentally altering your identity and surviving the valley of disappointment by relying on robust systems instead of fleeting goals. And finally, we looked at the practical mechanics of making those systems stick: temptation bundling, habit stacking, and most importantly, making peace with the profound, unglamorous boredom of mastery.
Which leads directly to our final challenge for you today. Take a hard look at your life and ask yourself, what is your personal boredom benchmark? Look at the major goal you claim to want so badly. What is the single most monotonous, repetitive, unglamorous task required to achieve it? The specific task you have been actively avoiding by consuming more content, by reorganizing your desk, by watching more motivational videos on YouTube.
What if the silence and the friction you feel when you finally sit down to do that boring work, the exact moments where no one is clapping, no one is watching, and it feels entirely unglamorous and painfully tedious? What if those moments are actually the only tangible proof that you are successfully changing your identity? The dopamine-fueled fantasy was always a prism, but the boredom of the daily process is your freedom.
Stop planning. Start practicing. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.